My name is Blake Dinius, and I work for Plymouth County Extension as the entomologist educator. Today we're going to be going on a tick walk. We're going to be talking a little bit about tick ecology, how is it that ticks bite us, what kind of diseases they may transmit, and most importantly, what are the best ways to protect yourself against tick bites. Alright, so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be flagging for ticks. I'm going to be checking out a lot of the edge of the trail, and I'm going to be doing that with this thing called a tick flag. And this is essentially just a piece of almost like polar fleece. Corduroy would also work very well. And the way that ticks attach to animals is by grabbing on with a claw. So this takes advantage of that type of behavior where the ticks are just going to want to cling to this flag as I drag it through. There really isn't any skill involved when it comes to either the flagging aspect on my end or even just the ticks grabbing onto the cloth. It's just this natural tendency they have when people start to approach to want to cling to things. A little bit like Velcro almost. What is the benefit of ticks? What role do they play in our ecosystems? So ticks are parasites. So probably one of their most largest benefits they contribute would be in some kind of population control, in the same way that a disease itself would play in population control. But the reason why ticks have, at least in recent years, seemed to be getting worse, so maybe higher prevalence of ticks, or maybe the ticks are carrying more pathogens, has a lot to do with the fact that how we've changed our ecology around us. And so what ticks really like, particularly our deer tick or black-legged tick, are the presence of these backyard animals. Things like deer, of course, but also white-footed mice, robins, chipmunks, shrews, voles. The deer tick feeds on over 125 different species of animal, including humans. And so when you think, they have a wide variety of animals they like to feed on, but they preferentially feed on these things that we like to see in our backyard, these suburban animals. And so what we're seeing is that in areas where we have a lot of suburban habitat, so an area like Norwell, for instance, where you might have a lot of different people living in their homes that abut woods and have these backyards that kind of built up into the woods, we see a higher prevalence and a higher incidence rate of tick-borne disease. And so we think that that might be one of the reasons why ticks are quote-unquote getting worse, is that we've actually changed the ecology to influence that. We don't really see ticks in the incidence rate as bad in areas that you have really deep backwoods, where it's much more either rural or you've got a lot more deeper extended contiguous forest. And we think that the reason behind that is these backyard critters end up being controlled by things like larger predators, maybe like bobcats or black bears, or maybe even wolves in some parts of the country. What's also interesting is that something like deer, which get a really bad reputation in relation to deer ticks, is that deer actually are what we call incompetent reservoir hosts. This means that deer are actually immune to Lyme, and if a tick that's carrying the agent that causes Lyme disease, Borrelia burgdorferi, bites a deer, that deer will no longer be able to pass on Lyme disease to anything else that it bites. Unfortunately, that tick will likely never feed again because it's generally the adults that are feeding on the deer. And after the adults feed, well, the males don't really feed, and then the adult females, they'll actually just go out and lay eggs and then die. But so you're really looking at, when it comes to how these diseases cycle in nature, it's really the small animals, things like white-footed mice, but also chipmunks are really, really important for this. And what we've noticed is that some birds too, like robins, are also play some role in this disease transmission. So the more of those small animals that you see, maybe the higher infection rates, and then the deer might play a role in the populations of ticks. So some of the very common myths surrounding ticks are the 24-hour rule. This is the rule where if you're bit by a tick, you have 24 hours to get it off before the virus or the pathogen, bacteria, is transmitted to your body. Now, this rule is for Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. it's more or less, maybe not a rule, but maybe more a common pattern. These tend not to transmit very quickly. But we do have some diseases that ticks can transmit, like Powassan virus, which can be transmitted in 15 minutes. So Powassan virus is an interesting virus. It's actually the only virus that we know of right now that you can get from a tick in this area. So there are some other tick-borne viruses, but we haven't really seen them in this area. This one gets its name, Powassan. Sounds like a funny word, right? But that's actually named after Powassan, Ontario, where they discovered it. This virus is cycled, we believe it's cycled between woodchucks and deer ticks. And even the woodchuck tick as well, which is not a very common sighting for this area. You notice it a little bit more up in Maine, or if you're spending a lot of time around woodchuck burrows. This virus has no cure, has no vaccine, and if you get it, we find that in the number of people that get it that actually develop symptoms, we notice there's about a 10% mortality rate with that. And but the good news is that it's relatively rare, and we do think that more people might be exposed to it than are developing symptoms. A little bit like people who might be exposed to West Nile virus, where they're just asymptomatic, even though they have been exposed to it. So that is some good news about Powassan virus. A few other myths would be in tick removal. There's actually quite a few surrounding that. The first is that you never want to be using matches, gasoline, nail polish remover, piece of cotton ball with dish soap. You don't want to be using those things to remove the tick. What you want to do is you just want to use a pair of tweezers and grab it by close to the skin and pull straight up. And this is the safest, most effective way to remove a tick. The other methods, the Vaseline or the nail polish remover, they may get the tick off, but we don't know how safe those methods actually are because they may cause that tick to regurgitate, and we're not sure what's in that tick spit. And the thought of forcing a tick to regurgitate into your body, now that can't be very fun. The other myth surrounding tick removal is that you have to get the head. And this is what a lot of people are calling the head, but technically it's just the mouth part. Ticks have a beak-like mouth. And this mouth, if you actually get the body of the tick off and that mouth part stays inside underneath your skin, that's actually okay. That's not going to continually transmit disease, but you can get a secondary infection, so you do want to apply some kind of antiseptic to it, like a Neosporin, or maybe alcohol or bacitracin, but that'll eventually work its way out much like a splinter. So if you're spending a lot of time digging that out and it's a big process, maybe you have a small child or a squirming dog, maybe you just want to leave that head or mouth part embedded in your skin. What eats ticks? So we've already established that ticks play a role in maybe population control for certain animals, but there's got to be a few animals that use ticks as a food source. And there are a lot of things that actually eat ticks. A lot of birds eat ticks, so when people raise the question of get chickens to eat ticks, well, chickens do eat ticks. And possums, what we've noticed is they're not outwardly seeking ticks to eat, but they're very obsessive groomers and will groom off many, many ticks. About over 95-ish% of the ticks that end up on a possum will get groomed off and eaten. We even have a wasp, a specialized wasp that will actually parasitize ticks, and which means that they'll actually lay their eggs inside the tick and the babies will develop, and then the wasp babies will eat that tick. And but the problem is that the ticks will blast out about 2,000 eggs every spring. So one female tick, if she gets a meal, will blast out about 2,000 eggs, and those will develop into babies. And so you have to think that there are many, many ticks kind of floating around, if you will, in the environment. And so what we see is that there really aren't enough predators of ticks that are keeping up with these populations. Now, if the predators didn't exist, we would be completely inundated with ticks. And so we do know that there is a high degree of mortality that ticks are seeing in the environment. It's just not enough. Ticks are still finding their food sources relatively easily before they can get eaten. And when it comes to ticks as well, they spend a lot of time in the undergrowth in these areas, and We think that for instance, some areas like underneath Japanese barberry or in these dense shrubs that are created by some of these invasive plants, that the ticks and their hosts may actually be protected from some of these predators that might be looking to eat them. So we're kind of caught in this situation where ticks seem to be getting worse based on our changing ecology, and there doesn't seem to be this natural control of ticks like we might want there to be. One of the best things we do is we try to focus on preventing bites, and we do that with a number of different things. We really focus on protecting our bodies, protecting our pets, and then protecting around our yards. Those are kind of a three-pronged approach because we notice that those are the avenues that people tend to pick up ticks. So when we want to talk about protecting ourselves, we're going to be talking about things like repellents, things like DEET or OFF. That's a very common repellent. And that you want to use about 20% or more. You don't need more. 100% doesn't protect better than 20%. But if you don't like DEET, you also have picaridin, IR3535, and oil of lemon eucalyptus. Now when it comes to DEET, I'm really confused by why people think that it's so toxic. There was a study that was released in 2002, and this is now looking at 16 years ago, and they had seen about 8 billion uses of DEET. And the World Health Organization records about 2 million uses of DEET annually. And in that time span, we've had DEET around for about 60 years. In that time span, there's only ever been 4 deaths that have been associated with DEET. Now, we've seen more deaths from chewing gum, yet people aren't afraid to give their kids chewing gum. So for some reason, DEET gets a bad reputation, but I think is relatively unjustified. It's pretty squeaky clean. The other thing we want to focus on when it comes to protecting ourselves, so that would be a repellent style that you would apply maybe right before you go. And you can apply this anywhere to clothing, skin, shoes. But there's another kind of product on the market called permethrin. And that's actually what I have treated in my pants and my shoes here. And this is something that will kill ticks. So any ticks that contact me are going to die. And it's very, very effective. This is something that lasts 6 washings or 1 month. Or if you get it professionally treated, it can last up to 70 washings. And this is not something you want to do right before you go out, but something you want to do maybe the day before or maybe even a week before. Since it has such a long-lasting effect, you want to spray this, wait for it to dry. If it's wet, it's just not going to do its job properly, and then you can enjoy that protection for a really long time. The other thing you want to caution yourself about when using this is you want to keep cats away until it's dry. When it's dry, it's a-okay for cats, but before that point, when it's wet, then you worry about it being absorbed into the cat's skin or maybe some oral exposure as well. You also don't want to apply it to skin. It's not that it's going to hurt you, it just is not going to work properly, it's not going to bind properly to your skin, and you're not going to get that effect that you really want. And so that's it for the personal protection side of things. When you're talking about wanting to protect your animals, you really want to speak to a veterinarian. Not only is our animals part of our family, but they can actually act a little bit like Trojan horses, where they might bring a tick into our homes. And when that tick can't live very long, on a day like this, it might only live for 1 or 2 days inside someone's house. It may live long enough to bite, and at that point, it's going to live as long as it needs to get blood. The last aspect we're going to talk about is protecting your yard. And this can be done either by at least this time of year, what you really want to do is be managing the leaves around your yard. So what they ran a study this year where they actually found, and we've known this for a little while, that ticks actually require leaves in order to survive. And now they know that the ticks require the leaves in order to survive the winter. So when you remove leaves, they actually have a higher degree of mortality throughout the winter season. And that's the other thing, is a lot of people don't realize that ticks, they live for 2 years, so they can survive these bitter cold temperatures. And they do that, one of the ways they do that is using leaves as insulation to buffer those cold winter temperatures. And so raking leaves, really important aspect in order to protect your yard. The other thing you want to do is, if you've got a lot of dense shrubs, you could trim those back. Again, ticks are really going to need that to survive. Ticks need 82% humidity or up. And so when you think about the surrounding humidity, if it's below 82%, now that tick is dying anytime it comes out under those environmental conditions. And so it needs to have another place in order to retreat that's above 82% to recuperate that moisture. And these are going to be things like we mentioned, leaves, dense shrubs. It could be tall grass, but not necessarily. Log piles, rock walls, all of these things are going to be prime habitats for ticks. Now the tall grass thing I think is a little bit overestimated. They actually ran a study this year where people had let their lawns grow for 3 weeks, and they surveyed it just doing exactly what I'm doing, dragging cloth over those people's yards, and you've got tall grass everywhere. They didn't find a single tick on those people's properties. So maybe not necessarily tall grass, but if you notice where I'm dragging, it's a lot of this kind of shrub-like vegetation, and that is actually what you would want to control in your yard. The last thing you can do is, and I know this is a very contentious, kind of hotly debated topic, you could actually spray your yard. And this is one of those things that it's a tool, you don't have to do it if you don't want to, but I would recommend not using an all-natural spray, using a synthetic. What they found is that the all-natural sprays don't actually protect much more than water. And so you're kind of throwing your money away with these all-naturals. They're a little bit like a gimmick or a scam. If you do want to get a yard spray, use a synthetic. If you don't like the idea of using something synthetic, then don't do a yard spray at all. But rest assured, if you're doing the synthetic yard spray, you can get very effective, very long-lasting control. And this product that they would spray is no different than what you would use to control grubs. So if you're already treating your lawn for grubs, you might as well go the extra step and treat for ticks as well. I mean, the grubs are really only about making your yard look nice, versus the tick control would actually keep your family safe. So ticks do get kind of a bad reputation. They do play a very valuable role in our ecosystems, as I mentioned, in population control. We have at least 12 species of ticks in Massachusetts, but it's really only 3 of them that we're concerned about with disease. So the rest of these ticks, the majority of them, we don't actually see, and they're kind of out doing their own thing, cycling in nature. The most important thing about ticks is that with the right knowledge and information, you can stay safe and you can prevent vector-borne disease. So my name is Blake Dinius. Thanks for coming out on our tick walk, and I hope to see you out on the trail.